So maybe we just want to start with thank you for returning for our session. We're probably going to be the second most riveting discussion that you're going to hear today. I know, shocking. But I'll start with introducing Jonathan. So Jonathan is the CEO and co-founder of Cranium AI, one of the leading AI security and trusted AI platforms. He ironically was a former KPMG partner. We can ask him why that switch occurred. Would love to hear more. And he has over 20 years with experience in technology, third-party risk management, security in particular. And Jonathan, as a fun fact, is also a magician. So we're going to have to do a little magic following that last act. But I want to start with Jonathan. Maybe talk a little bit about your transition. There's been a lot of themes around being an entrepreneur, and we'd also like to talk about governance as it relates to corporate organizations. But let's start with kind of your switch from KPMG into Cranium, and then we'll kind of dive into some of the experiences you've had recently, because you had a relevant experience on the Hill that I also think could be interesting for the group to hear about.
Yeah, so this is like a homecoming for me, by the way. So it's funny, agreed with a lot of what that panel said. A little bit I was in a bit of disagreement, but that entrepreneurship piece of that is right on, right? So I was a partner at KPMG for about 4 years. Prior to that, I ran a software company called Prevalent, which I sold to a private equity firm. And I saw this opportunity at KPMG as we were building into my practice a lot of AI. And it was interesting because KPMG is not generally the place where software entrepreneurs go, right? Like, I think, generally people go to KPMG, then build a software company, right? I did the exact opposite. And what was exciting for me was I got to work with the biggest companies in the world. I saw how AI was getting implemented there in my practice, and it was basically bypassing every single DevSecOps process for software development that had been built over the preceding 20 years. You mentioned I was in this for 20 years. I'm thinking like, if Peter's right, that's only like, it's early in my career now, right?
You're only 20 then, right?
Right, exactly.
Because you took the pill early.
But what was like really fortunate about my time at KPMG was we saw this as an opportunity, and the leadership here, I pitched the firm on the idea of Cranium because I felt from a mission perspective, I wanted to go build a platform that would enable that to happen securely. And I literally worked and talked to 100 different CISOs. None of them were doing this. They weren't securing AI as it was going into production. And so I worked with the KPMG studio team here, run by Anu and Cliff and the rest of the team. And it was an amazing experience. So they literally funded this new idea. They put the first $3 million in. And then I had the fortunate experience of spinning it out in 2023. And we raised about $40 million of additional capital so far, and we're going to go do our Series B. So it's been a really exciting time. And I can tell you that, yeah, AI is absolutely the top item on everybody's strategic list today. We heard $1 billion a day. Almost none of it is being spent on security yet.
Yeah, one of the things Jonathan and I were reflecting on is this idea of moving fast, implementing AI at scale, moving to agentic. And on one hand, it's like, it's great, but then in certain industries, when we meet with some of our clients, it's what happens when you're responsible for the relationship with a company that has 3 people that founded it, and now we have to think about the risk associated with that relationship, and how do I get comfortable with deploying this at scale within my organization?
Yep.
And then the other piece of it is we were talking about deregulation. Jonathan and I have been following the regulatory landscape around AI for the past 8 years. And I mean, I would say we're still not there yet. We haven't seen prescriptive AI regulations consistently enforced. I would say there's pockets of examples where we see inquiries within financial services. We've seen very limited fines with some of the tech conglomerates related to AI governance. And so it's yet to be seen of what does it really mean to regulate, provide transparency, have accountability, auditability, and security around AI solutions. So I think that's an interesting concept as well. Is every CIO, CTO that I meet with is saying, how do I do as little as possible and deploy as fast as possible? And how can I do this in an agile, modular way? Because I don't want to overgovern. I don't want to lose stride competitively with where the market's headed using AI. But at the same time, I have a responsibility, to safeguard our assets, our data, our resources, et cetera.
Yeah, and I think it's clear what we've done in the past is not going to work here, right? So this cannot be just a paper process. I think many of you in this room are in very large organizations. When you hear that, the enterprise wants to use this software application built by 3 people in a garage, right? It kind of harkens back to a time that we lived in before, where now, we've gone through decades of building these processes that are now falling down again. And we need to think about how do we technically understand what AI is doing in our environment. Just last week, we were working with one of the largest telecom companies in the world. One of their business units came to the security team and the AI governance team with an agentic capability that they've been building for 6 months. And they said, this is a CEO imperative. We need to get this deployed in 6 weeks. Now, some of you work in very large organizations. When was the last time you deployed anything in 6 weeks, right? But that's the pace at which almost every enterprise is being forced to look at these applications. And so this is really going to come down to how do we really think about governance, security, and the things that are going to be really necessary to get these into production as fast as the business wants to go. And we need this to be continuous. We need this to be AI-driven itself, and we need to make sure that this is in place so that we can go faster. I think most people think of the CISO or the AI governance team as the no, right? Like, we're not going to do something. I think that is going to flip on its head as this gets AI-enabled, and that's the mission.
Yeah, the way I think about it is anywhere where technology and people intersect, we should be expecting that AI is going to be there. Yeah. And so this idea of having a detective and reactive stance to governing has to flip, and we need to be much more proactive. We need to think about architecting solutions with technical controls. I think the user experience and the interface, I heard earlier today this, the idea around personas, becomes a way that we can actually govern by design by saying, I have certain groups of users that need a more precise or a more accurate outcome, and so we can allow them to have a prompt improver. We can structure their experience to get a more accurate output, whereas I want my developers to have a playground, and I want them to do more R&D experimentation in an improved sandbox, and that's a much different feel and experience. And so to me, the governance shouldn't be, we have to do big G governance, but nobody likes it. Nobody likes talking about risk. So how do we flip the conversation into, this is actually about, the user design and the experience that we want to guide users, and where do we need users to interject in the process, and where do we start getting comfortable removing humans from the process or in the loop. And so kind of redefining how we think about digitizing governance, if you will.
I think there's a lot of people that are trying to put governance or put regulation or, one of the big themes for them was like, does security by design work? Mm-hmm. Like, is that actually something that we could actually put out there and help organizations meaningfully implement? And, as a number of AI companies have kind of signed this pledge for security by design. We work with many of them. So like largest bank in the world uses our platform to look at third parties that are bringing AI-based services into the bank as a single example. I can tell you 95% of them don't have security by design as part of their process for developing their AI. So we have like a ton of work to do, but I found it very fortunate that they were asking the question, at least the second, third, and fourth question. First one scared me to death.
And I think to the point you raised about AI security, I think we've over-indexed on certain governance principles around like fairness, accountability, explainability. We have not yet made it to a point where we have a technique where we can actually apply explainability to agentic AI. There are techniques where we can actually evaluate the brain behind the LLM to see which nodes are lighting up that helped contribute to the decision. But this concept around, can we get explainability? There's still limitations in what we can do from a governance front, but there's also still core principles focused on, and I think security now that we have AI as a service is one of them. Yep. And so not surprising that our representatives are asking questions around security in particular.
I love the fact that they're doing that. I think we need to broaden it out. The challenge with asking about bias originally, that was kind of what the first question as people were going into this. And it was a tough question because I think in many cases that was more of a legal question, right? So you saw like New York DFS, if you're a financial services organization looking for definitions that really more legal than necessarily, how to think about it. That's how we started really trying to understand how could we technically test these systems at a scale and a pace where, we're being asked to look at 70,000 repositories. You saw the vibe coding. Guess what that means? In the next year, you're going to double all of your repos in your GitHub repository, right? Maybe triple. So most of them will have AI embedded in them. So how do we think about getting coverage of that? And then, so we really wanted to understand how could we test this technically? I think the legal questions are harder. I think we still need to get that base understanding of who's doing this work, how's it coming together. AI governance teams have been set up over the last couple of years, and they're struggling with this. It's people are coming together, creating a policy, and that policy it's very difficult to effectuate in production at that scale.
Yeah, one of the other concepts we were discussing is every organization now has an AI steering committee, an AI risk working group or committee that have written policies, and now the question becomes how do we enforce it and how do we do that at scale? And so the idea of how do we digitize and design security and other controls as part of the process becomes one of the key challenges with scaling and moving fast. I think there's a lot of friction today still in how we evaluate risk associated with these systems and what it means to actually put in the right governance and controls to expedite moving a solution through. And again, that cycle time has to change, but also the methods that we're using has to change. One of the clients that I worked with is one of the tech conglomerates, and very federated. I would say 2/3 of the organization is data science engineers, some of which they're paying $200 million to build LLMs, and then the other third is privacy, and it's how do we prevent getting into legal trouble. But their design is truly where do we have the highest risk, and let's build technical accelerators that can be built into the code and allow the engineers to self-service if they need to elect to include that piece in their code or not, and that's what they're going with for now.
Yeah,
right?
And look, all the smart people, some of which are in the room that elected to put $3 million to start this business, that was the vision, right? Like we need a different way to think about this. What's happened in the past isn't going to work in the future. And I think when we see examples where, there are a lot of organizations that are really focused on this problem. I haven't seen an organization get to scale yet where they can cover, and we talked about agents, right? We have some customers that are looking at, like, how do I deploy 60,000 agents that are now going to be connected to pretty much all the tools that we've been using? They're going to have access to their data sets. How do we understand what the risk of that looks like? And they're still doing it, right? So fundamentally, the business is kind of pushing on this, but I think they're still ill-prepared to understand the outcome of some of these decisions.
Maybe the last question for you, Jonathan, being that you're a CEO, and how do we think about sort of the skill pivoting that needs to happen? I know there was a lot of debate about education and how we educate the younger workforce. Now I think about, if I'm a supervisor of a group of agents, is my compensation driven off of AI performance? Like, how do we start to think about the evolving business structures and the resources needed to augment and work with AI? And have you started to think about that within your own company?
Yeah, 100%. So, I get the pleasure to talk about how we think about the future of this, get a team together to help build it, but also like, how does this affect my business? So, you're seeing a lot of scaled enterprises trying to work on this to, get efficiency and reduce their, workforce potentially. I want to make sure that we are AI enabled as we're building that workforce, right? So for me, we sat in a conversation with a group of the KPMG portfolio companies yesterday, and this was a really specific topic. And so how do we think about a group of people where historically you'd have a manager that would manage, 10 people, and that would be their role? I think there is a place where they're managing 2 people and 8 agents, right? So how do we think about compensation? I have to make decisions about, what my employee stock pool looks like. How do we, and going into the next round, how much equity do we need? How can we afford now, given that structure, can we afford to pay double to those people who are now managing the work, or does that all accrete to the business? And I think these answers we don't have answers yet.
Them yet.
And so I think these are the things that, KPMG, we're going to work on together. We're going to think about these problems. But we also have resources with people who are going through the same thing, right? Both startups that hopefully will never build that huge infrastructure and have to let half of the people go, as well as large enterprises that are now trying to AI enable all these processes and are thinking about potentially massive layoffs. And we talked about that earlier, which socially could have a really, unfortunate consequence. So I think we need to build that leadership. I agree with that. I want to build more entrepreneurship. Like, I want people to think about how could they do this themselves? How do they do this? In my last company, 6 of my executives, became CEOs. I'm proud of that, right? So I think we need to think about how do we do that with AI now.
And with that, we will open it up for questions and see if there's any questions from the audience. Like I said, second most riveting topic today, so I'm expecting a lot of chatter.
Hello, this is Steve Holden. Hey, Kelly, from Fannie Mae. Curious on your views around whether models, LLM models should be managed as models or technology. I think there's been a bifurcation, certainly in the FI space around, when you're dealing with these models that have a lot of these like explainability issues. How do we govern them? How do we regulate them? How do we think about them? And there's certainly a different track if you think about them as models versus if you think about them as technology. So I'm curious of your views on that.
I have a thought. I think a lot of it, especially in the financial services industry, it comes down to what's your unit of measure, because now we have the model, we have data, we might have the application around it to help service the model. We might have multiple models serving models. And so I think it becomes a question of, do we understand, and as we move into agents, we're not using AI as a service, we're actually using a combination of different agents with orchestration, with other bits of technology. So to me, it becomes each aspect that creates the AI system should be registered in your inventory, should have appropriate governance based on the function that it's doing, and should be tagged as an overall AI system. But I think then that parts of that become reusable assets, right? You might be using OpenAI in multiple solutions. I had a client that, they're using OpenAI's API for white label chat, but then they're also using Now Assist on ServiceNow, which we found out you can use the ServiceNow LLM or actually OpenAI. So then I had the question of, well, how many times are you paying to use OpenAI? But regardless, I think it becomes this, can we actually start to catalog things that have similar patterns and characteristics and govern them in the same way and say, hey, we've seen this before, we've done this is the same thing. Maybe it's just deployed or stitched together with other bits and pieces, and we call that the system, and we can look at that holistically as well. But I think it's about unit of measure, and then how do we expedite the governance process around those units of measure individually and collectively. I don't know if you have thoughts, Jonathan.
I totally agree with that. So we've looked at this as the AI system. So we look for system composition. So that's what our product does. It looks for what are those components, how do we map those, and then how do we simulate them and attack them effectively so that we can generalize that information and then make it specific to the vulnerabilities you need to plug. However, I do think that there's a place where some of these trends that we've been talking about the last couple of days, like geopolitical trends. So, DeepSeek was a seminal moment for what we look at in our industry, right? Because I ran third-party security here, and the target breach is the thing that people point to as like that seminal moment when people worried about third-party security and risk. Here, DeepSeek popped up, and all of a sudden it was available in pretty much every hyper, scaler's, management environment. You could download it, you could use it, and you put it in production pretty much within 2 weeks of it getting launched. The problem was it was a huge geopolitical risk. And so there were a lot of banks that we work with that were like, where is this? Mm-hmm. Are our developers using it? Are the third parties actually implementing this? And are we going to allow this? And so I think there is a model-specific piece when we look at concentration risk. I think when we think about some of the vulnerabilities, by the way, we have an arena where we test models. There isn't an invulnerable model. Every single model that we've tested, especially inside of these systems, is vulnerable. But there are also many vulnerabilities to the toolkits and technologies that surround them as well. So the answer, I think, is we need to get a better understanding across the supply chain. Like, I want to know what model's being used. I want to know whether or not it meets these obligations. DeepSeek is one of those that people are like pushing back on right now, right? I don't necessarily have safety concerns around it. I don't necessarily, it's very performant from a price and against the pricing, but maybe I'm not comfortable that from an origin perspective, and I want to understand it so that I can replace it. And that those are some of the conversations why I think it's still important to understand the model piece also.
Any final questions?
Yeah, so Kelly and Jonathan, as AI continues to advance, it's becoming increasingly easier for bad actors to use the technology and spread misinformation and create deep fakes at scale. So I'm curious, what strategies or advancements are you seeing from a technology perspective to help mitigate that?
She asked it. We were warned a little bit, like Aisha was going to
I think you had an answer to it.
Yeah, look, I think deepfakes are, so most of you are probably pretty aware that like phishing attacks are still way more prevalent and more successful than they should be, right? And if you think about like the major cyber trends historically, you could probably name them, right? Like phishing and malware and those pieces. We are getting into an era where like you're going to go into a Teams meeting and there's a possibility that there'll be a deep fake and it'll look like your boss and talk like your boss and ask you to do things, right? Like that's scary, and I think it's really hard to train against, right? So I think a lot of this is going to have to be machine to machine, right? So if we think about it, like I fundamentally don't believe that like the current process of training people against things like phishing are going to work anymore. Like we've been looking for how well written an email is, right? Now it's going to look like and sound like my boss. So I think we need different techniques. I don't think we should be dependent upon humans to figure that out. I think this is going to be kind of an AI to an AI solve. I think it has to be somewhat in line, given the fact that like we're going to see this. We don't build deepfake technology at Cranium, but we partner with some that do. This is a really, really hard problem. I don't think this is going to get solved before many, many people are going to deal with the fraud that's based on this.
And maybe the result of, things like deepfakes and other scamming attacks will actually encourage folks to think more about governance, right, Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, we talked about this as how are we thinking about this? I think about this from how do I build systems that are resilient to things like data poisoning? How do I put things in place that can help understand whether or not it's susceptible to these types of risks? But yeah, I mean, the first time somebody calls you and it sounds like your boss and looks like your boss, I want to see what happens, right? And then it isn't. What you say? I mean, we're starting to see it now.
And then there's the idea of removing humans, from making that judgment call. It's like, are we actually better off or worse off by allowing humans to say, is that my boss asking me to do the thing, or allowing some kind of discovery tools to proactively search and prevent that from
Yeah,
going
the
through.
CISO at Aetna, the former CISO, his name's Jim Routh, he used to talk about email security this way. Like, if we have to train people to look for deep fakes and that is our line of defense.
Like, we're in trouble.
Like, that's going to fail. Yeah,
Yeah.
so we do need to put things in line that'll support that. I think it's going to get harder and harder. But
Great, thank you, everyone. We really appreciate you hanging
Thank
with
you.
us.
No mushrooms.